Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for being together with us this evening. I am Emir Alışık. Today we continue with another talk of our book launch and pre-launch series at Anamet. So previously we held panels for Syrian Stylites edited by Barbara Crostini and Christian Hogel, and Roman Constantinople in Byzantine Perspective by Paul Magdaleno. In today's talk, I am excited to collaborate yet another time with Jeremy Swist, today's guest speaker. We first worked with him back in 2021 for a book project and a podcast show. That time our topic was the reception of Byzantine history in metal music. Today it will be very different actually. So he will introduce us to several themes present in his upcoming book, Julian Augustus, Platonism, Myth and the Refounding of Rome, to be published by the Oxford University Press soon. And as you can see, you can pre-order it now. The book is based on Swist's PhD dissertation that he completed at the Classics Department of the University of Iowa. Jeremy Swist is an incoming assistant professor of classical studies at Michigan State University. He has published on pagan rhetoric, philosophy, historiography, and medicine under the Roman Empire, as well as the reception of ancient Greece, Rome, and Byzantium in heavy metal music. So after the talk, you can, of course, address your questions to him. And now, for now, please join me welcoming Jeremy Swist.
İyi akşamlar. First off, I would like to extend a huge thank you to Amir and Anamed for not only inviting me here to this amazing city and putting me up here in the Institute for free for a week so that I could explore the city for the first time in my life, the city where the Emperor Julian was born. And so you'll find that a number of photographs that I put into this lecture were from were photos that I took just in the past few days while exploring the city for the first time. The first of which you see here is the likely sarcophagus of Julian that you may know is just outside the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. I spent a good deal of time outside of it before going into the museum, and you'll find there's some stuff from in the museum that I include as well. So again, much gratitude to Amir and to Anamed for this wonderful opportunity. I feel really blessed. Okay, so I'm starting with this particular photo here because this is where Julian ends up, at least his mortal remains ends up, right back in the city of his birth. But the thing is that it doesn't seem that he actually wanted to be buried here. As far as we know, it was according to his wishes to be buried in the city of Tarsus, or at least that's where he was deposited originally after he died in 363. The Emperor Julian decorated his tomb in Tarsus, and according to Ammianus, and then sometime later, some decades or whatever later, eventually his mortal remains were transferred to Constantinople to the Church of the Holy Apostles, though probably outside of the church, given his apostasy, and as we see, with no Christian iconography on the sarcophagus, which is one of the main lines of reasoning for identifying this as the tomb of Julian, among others. So now that Folia has, Dr. Folia Celikal-Soanchi, another friend among many who has supported me and entertained me with food and drink this week, has arrived, I will get to sort of the lead-in portion of this talk. And so Amir, when he asked me if I wanted to give a talk here in town, he was thinking, oh, you should talk about Byzantium and heavy metal, which I have collaborated with him on before. And I decided it would be a better opportunity to talk about Julian, given that my book is coming out. However, to indulge those who may be more interested in that former topic, I present to you the lyrics to the first ever heavy metal song written about Julian. This is by a British death metal band from the United Kingdom called Spearhead. And this song was written and it came out in 2007, which is hard to believe is like, what, 18 years ago. So I'm just going to play you like 10, 15 seconds of it just to give you an idea of what you might be getting into if I had to do a whole talk on this. Okay? So those of you who like to hear that, well, you'll just have to invite me back to talk about it again. But another reason I'm using this as a lead-in, it's not just frivolous. In fact, this is the only metal song about Julian that mentions Constantinople. There's a growing list of metal songs that are based on Julian from bands throughout the world, including a band from Argentina called Tercibel that put out an entire concept album on Ammianus, and I have an article on that hopefully coming out next year. So you can see some familiar phrases incorporated here, but Spearhead was the first, right? And in fact, they anticipated the title of my book partly as well. But as you see from the lyrics, it's one mention of Constantinople is not flattering to this city, right? Enter the decayed palace of Constantinople. Well, wait a minute. Wasn't Constantinople founded like a couple decades before he came to power? That palace is probably relatively new, and yet it's already in a state of decay. You can see here that this is not meant to be taken literally. This is symbolic of the association of Christianity and the Constantinian dynasty with darkness and error and sort of a divergence from the true path of light represented by Julian, who is returning to that, an age of reason and free thought as opposed to, the sheep of the Good Shepherd and things like that. And this is very much within a lot of the themes of heavy metal for those who know. And the fact that this is the only metal song on Julian that mentions Constantinople reminds me a lot of how Julian approaches the city too. And the thing is that he doesn't actually talk about it much in his own writings, despite what other people, his contemporaries and modern scholars, may say about his relationship with the city that he was born in. Julian was the first Roman emperor to be born in this city, okay, which is somewhat ironic given who he is, but he has that claim, okay? And that's not to say that Constantinople doesn't get mentioned a lot in heavy metal. It does. Okay, there are a number of metal songs by bands throughout the world, okay, that talk about this city, including bands from Scandinavia referring to it as Miklagard, with the Varangian Rus coming to serve the emperor in the Varangian Guard. And the Byzantinist my friend Antje Boselman-Rukby recently published an article where you can learn more about that. Okay, in fact, I listened to a whole playlist of these kinds of songs as I was flying here the other day, okay, just to get that inspiration. Okay. So for example, these are lyrics of a German band, and this is a very catchy chorus that was in my head as I was walking around here today. Had a very similar impression on the city as perhaps these Vikings did when they first walked in, based on what they're used to. Okay, so what am I going to talk about in this talk? So as I alluded to before, the ancient contemporary sources of Julian, as well as modern scholars, I think tend to overstate Julian's affection for his own fatherland, for his own birthplace. Okay, and so we'll see what he actually says. And part of that is, I believe that he has a visceral and negative association of the place with the trauma and that he experienced in his childhood at the hands of Constantius II, his cousin, and members of the Constantinian dynasty, as well as his association of the city with Constantine and thereby Christianity, okay, which of course he was an enemy of, to the greatest degree. Okay. Also, we will discuss some of his possible contributions to the city, which I argue are perfunctory. Any Roman emperor who is based in a major city for 5 months is inevitably, will contribute some building projects to its upkeep, right? That's just what you do, right? It would be a bad look if you didn't do that. Also, he expresses that it's often out of filial obligation, right? I should be doing this, otherwise it would be a bad look, He says it himself. Finally, and this is something that I talk about more at length in the book than in my talk, is that Julian, I think, was trying to reset the balance between Rome and Constantinople that his predecessors of the Constantine dynasty were trying to establish, and much more in favor of Rome and Athens when we're talking about the city in the east that he wants to be uplifted in importance at Constantinople's expense. Okay. So just for a bit of context, again, this is part of a section of my book, and so a lot of things I will leave out. But just to give you an idea how this fits into my wider argument within my book, here's just some key points. So I focus on Julian's own writings. How did he articulate his own identity as an emperor in the context of his intellectual thought world, his intellectual community of pagan, theurgic, radical, Hellenic Neoplatonists, right? And how does he use those doctrines to apply to Roman history and mythology as the basis for his own imperial ideology, And I connect this to something that Dilyana Angelova wrote about 10 years ago in her book Sacred Founders, where Roman emperors routinely try to present themselves as new founders of Rome, or in the case of Constantine, a founder of a new Rome. And I think Julian is playing into that as well in presenting himself as a new founder of Rome, not of Constantinople necessarily. And this also fits into some other wider trends of how emperors promote ideology in order to present themselves as renewing and restoring the republic, the city, the empire after a period of chaos and misrule and darkness and chaos by their predecessors, in Julian's case, Constantine and Constantius. And finally, I come to a number of conclusions where I consider how Julian, if we pay attention to the things he himself says about himself and take it seriously, runs against some of the common assumptions about who Julian presented himself as. I see him as more of a realist than an idealist. He was very down to earth, in my opinion. He had to be. He was an emperor. He had to be very practical, pragmatic. He thought of himself, again, down to earth, more human than divine. He is rejecting a lot of how his predecessors, including in the Tetrarchy with Diocletian, kind of elevated their own person to a level of semi-divinity. He does not see himself in the same terms. He is very much influenced by philosophy and has a philosophical identity, that's for certain. However, he tends to downplay his philosophical identity in favor of a soldierly identity. Being an emperor is a job. Being a philosopher is a job. You can't do both at once. It's not possible in his mind. And finally, and this plays into the theme of this talk, is that Julian, while writing in Greek, thinking in Greek, influenced by Greek literature and philosophy and whatnot, he really presents himself as more Roman than Greek in many respects, because he recognizes that it is his job to be Roman emperor, and he is going to take it seriously. And I believe that his commitment to the city of Rome and privileging of the city of Rome is an extension of that, even at the expense of his own birthplace here. And then I won't go into this as much, but also my book is in a response to a lot of Christianizing readings of Julian, which I can talk about some other time. Okay, so this wonderful Venn diagram shows you sort of what we have to work with when we are discussing Julian and sort of how to think of his identity and other topics. And Julian has a lot of writings, a lot of different types of writings, and that's what I focus on in this book. What does Julian say about himself in his own words? And historians often have to weigh this against the testimony of his contemporaries, both his fanboys, his pagan contemporaries, as well as the haters, right? Gregory Nazianzus, those guys who I saw in the Cora the other day, right? As well as things like inscriptions, also more fanboys in Latin, as well as media from official imperial media like Coins and Laws, where, yes, he has input into that, but it is not entirely under his control. So what does Julian actually say? And let's not let some of this other stuff kind of influence our interpretation as much as it has on the topic of what is his relationship to Constantinople and his attitude. Okay? All right, so Julian, what is his relationship to the founder of Constantinople? Okay, as we see from this genealogy here, Julian here is the nephew of Constantine I. However, Julian's father, Julius Constantius, here he is only a half-brother of Constantine. Okay, and so Julian's immediate predecessor is the son, one of the sons of Constantine Constantius II. Okay, so they are cousins. Now, Julius Constantius, Julian's father. Sorry if this is a little complicated, but royal dynasties can get a lot more complicated than this. Say, look at the Julio-Claudians, for instance. Okay, so Constantine is the son of the Tetrarch Emperor Constantius I and an earlier consort named Helena, who is also a very significant figure in this city and the history of Christianity. Okay. However, once Constantius is elevated to the Tetrarchy by Maximian and Diocletian, he then officially marries a wife named Theodora, who is the daughter of Maximian, the Tetrarch, colleague of Diocletian. Okay, and from the marriage with Theodora, we get Julius Constantius along with some other brothers. Okay, so what we essentially have here is two different branches of the dynasty, stretching from Constantius I, and before that, at least according to propaganda, Claudius Gothicus. Julian represents what I call the Theodoran branch, whereas Constantine and Constantius and the rest represent the Helena's branch. And so I feel that, I believe that Julian often is, in his sort of self-legitimization in his writings, is asserting that he is the legitimate successor and heir to the dynasty, going back to the official marriage of into the Tetrarchy, rather than the branch coming from Constantine, which was illegitimate, okay, according to him, and made further illegitimate by Constantine abandoning his devotion to Sol Invictus and the pagan rites of the sun god, Helios, and in favor of Christianity. Okay, so though that context might make sense of why Julian might have an ambivalent relationship to the city founded and supported by that branch of his wider dynasty. Okay. All right. Next, we're going to look at a bit of a timeline to see how the events in Julian's biography intersect with the city of Constantinople. Of course, one of the most important things is that he was born here in 331. So he just a little after the city was officially founded and converted from Byzantium to Constantinople, or Nova Roma, by Constantine, Julian is born. Okay, first Roman emperor to be born here. Okay. He is about 5 years old in 337. That's when his uncle Constantine I dies, and Constantius II, his cousin, along with the other two sons of Constantine, succeed, and they undertake a massacre of most of the Theodoran branch of the Constantine's dynasty, but they spare Julian and his half-brother Gallus because they were very young. Okay? And so many people see this as a very traumatic event in Julian's life that might account for why he has negative associations with this city and with that part of the dynasty, okay? Because it happened here. The fact that I can say it happened here, right? Just as an American scholar, just is I'm still processing it. Okay. While he is still very young, he then spends most of his time actually with his maternal grandmother on an estate in Bithynia. So he's largely out of the city in a place that is much more pleasant. And when he writes in his in his consolation to Seleucus that he is very fond of this general region near where he was born, but not this specific city. Okay, so this was a pleasant time for him, an escape from all of this. However, in the 340s, as he is later in his childhood and becoming a teenager, then Constantius II, who is ruling this part of the empire at the time, packs off him and his cousin and his half-brother Gallus to essentially an estate called Macellum out in Cappadocia, and where he is further educated, but essentially kept in some kind of glorious, luxurious exile. Okay. However, toward the end of the 340s, he is let go, and he pursues his education in Constantinople. He returns here, but he doesn't stay long here, because then Constantius orders him to go to nearby Nicomedia, okay, to pursue his education there. He is studying Greek literature and rhetoric and eventually philosophy at this time. So you can see that Constantius is intentionally keeping his young cousin, away from this city, okay, so that he doesn't make any connections here. He doesn't do any sort of networking so that he might potentially become a political threat to him. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind. All right, eventually by the 350s, he starts becoming more interested in philosophy, Platonism, and so he studies under various Neoplatonists of the school of Iamblichus in places like Pergamum, later in Ephesus under his mentor Maximus. And then he also, in 355, has what I call a summer study abroad program in Athens. And probably around 351 is under the influence of these radical Hellenic theurgic Neoplatonists, he apostatizes. He abandons Christianity, and as a result of his conversion to philosophy, adopts devotion to the Olympian pagan gods, the traditional gods of the empire. Okay. You'll notice that these coins are the ones that are in the archaeological museum, as another of my photos. In 355, Julian is the only other male heir to the dynasty left for Constantius, and Constantius has to deal with problems in the east with the Sassanid Persians, but there's also a lot of problems along the Rhine frontier in Gaul, and so Constantius sends Julian to Gaul and elevates him to the rank of Caesar, of junior emperor under the Augustus, which is Constantius II. And it turns out that Julian is a very quick study, and either through very good propaganda or perhaps preternatural talent, he actually earns the respect of his troops and becomes a very capable general and leader and politician. And probably his finest hour is a victory over the Germanic or barbarian invaders at the Battle of Strasbourg or Argentoratum in 357. And in fact, Van Terceval that I mentioned from Argentina, the first song on the concept album of Julian is called Argentoratum, about that battle, and it's based on Ammianus's account. Okay, but anyway, that's me slipping into my other research specialty once again. Okay, I blame Folia. All right, by 360, he becomes so popular that his army decides, we would rather follow you than the orders of this other guy who is way across on the other end of the empire. And so they proclaim him Augustus illegally. This is a usurpation. This is a very common thing that happens just throughout the history of the Roman Empire, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries, as we are here. Okay, and eventually Julian is on a collision course with Constantius in civil war. However, before their armies could meet, Constantius very conveniently dies of a fever, and leaving Julian as the natural successor to the dynasty, and so, hey, congratulations, you're emperor. It's not likely he would have won if he actually faced Constantius in battle. So this happens in November of 361. Constantius died in the city of Mopsucrine, which is, I think, around the middle of this country. And then Julian enters Constantinople once again for the first time since he was rather young, in December of 361. Okay, by this point he's in his late 20s. Okay. In Constantinople, he's here for about 5 or 6 months. And this is really his first time in the eastern half of the empire, and he has to be here to consolidate his rule, to work on his relationship with the eastern armies, who had so recently been his enemy, to consolidate power, form his court or cabinet, as you were. And of course, while he's here, he's naturally going to engage in various building projects and other things in order to make himself look legitimate as an emperor who is doing nice things for the city that he happens to be staying in. Okay. However, once he consolidates power here, he is now ready for the next step, which is to launch, or rather resume, a war with the Sassanid Persian Empire that his predecessors had been pursuing, because he believes that a great victory by himself, okay, would further legitimize his rule, especially also validate his belief that the pagan traditional gods of the empire were the ones that really give victory to the Romans, rather than this new upstart god from Galilee, as he would say. So he goes to Antioch as a base of operations for his army, and he winters there before the campaigning season. And it's in Antioch that he has a lot of his literary activity, and he doesn't really get along with the locals for various reasons I don't have to get into right now. But eventually in March, he goes on the Persian campaign, which is initially successful. He gets all the way to Ctesiphon in the middle of modern-day Iraq. But then things get a little bogged down, and he eventually decides to march back to Roman territory in order to winter and then continue the campaign the next year. However, as he is marching back to Roman territory, there is a skirmish, an ambush by the Persians, and he dies in battle. And he is succeeded by an emperor named Jovian, who happens to be a Christian, and all the emperors after that were Christian, and, well, you Byzantinists know the rest. Okay. All right. Let's start looking at some sources. David will recognize this illustration. Many of you, the rest of you will perhaps as well. So I'll start with what Julian's contemporaries or near contemporaries say about his relationship and his activity here in Constantinople. And Ammianus Marcellinus is one of our most reliable sources, though, of course, there's a lot that we have to take with a grain of salt. And he says, and these are all my translations, uplifted by the support of all, he set upon his journey to Antioch. Okay, so this is in about June of 362. Leaving behind a Constantinople built up with very great embellishments. Having been born there, he loved and fostered it as the fatherland that bore him. Okay, so Ammianus naturally, okay, would assume that Julian did a lot of building here because he was born here, and therefore, he would love to see the city of his birth, glorified and magnified. Okay. Again, I would respond to this to say that any emperor who is in a major city, especially a functional capital city for that long, is of course going to embellish it, okay, to clean it up, improve infrastructure, and to kind of leave their mark on it. Okay, this is standard imperial practice. Now, there's a number of things that Julian possibly built here, or brought here, or tried to bring here. And they are as follows. The first one I'm not going to talk too much because it's a rather complicated matter that I could probably talk about in Q&A if you're interested, but that's the Temple of Tuke, or of Fortune, which I believe he connects to the goddess Cybele, whose cult statue was brought over across the Sea of Marmara from Cyzicus. But the next thing I'll talk about is the obelisk that is here in the Hippodrome, but he's not the one that got it here. I'll also talk about the harbor, which is probably the one thing that he probably had the greatest influence in being constructed. Then there's a portico that he probably didn't build, a library he probably didn't build, and a senate house that he probably didn't build. Okay. So let's start with the obelisk. Another photo I took the other day. So you're probably wondering, well, why am I talking about an obelisk that clearly was brought here by Theodosius. We've got this wonderful relief and inscription saying so. Okay, Theodosius the First being put in the hippodrome here. Well, it turns out that Julian tried to get it here before Theodosius did, and it didn't work. Okay, and so Julian, actually, one of Julian's many letters that we have preserved is a letter to the city of Alexandria, where he says, hey, you got this obelisk, can we have it here in Constantinople? And so this is what he says: I hear there is a stone obelisk in your neighborhood, one of considerable height when stood upright, evidently, but currently lying flat, supine, on the shore like some totally worthless object. The blessed Constantius, that means he's dead, had a barge built to transport it to my fatherland, Constantinople, Patras. But since he happened to depart on his destined journey from this life, as the gods willed, the city requests the monument from me, because she is my fatherland and more attached to me than to him. He loved her like a sister, okay, because its father was Constantine, while I love her like a mother. Since I was born nearby and raised there, and I cannot be inconsiderate of her. Okay? So, on the surface, it looks like Julian is professing his love for Constantinople. But I would read this a little more carefully. Okay? He goes at length saying that it wasn't my idea to bring it here. Or it wasn't even my wish to bring this obelisk here. This project was originally actually undertaken by Constantine. He had this thing brought from Heliopolis way up the Nile and brought to Alexandria, where it remained until, as now Julian comes in and says, Constantius ordered a barge to bring it over. That didn't happen before Constantius died. And so the city made a petition to Julian to get this obelisk there. Okay? And so Julian is saying this wasn't my own idea. Okay? This was that of the city. And I'm just performing a filial obligation here. Okay, and further, he's trying to sweeten the deal. Why should the Alexandrians listen to him instead of the previous emperors who tried to get the obelisk here? Okay, he goes on to say, so what? Since I also love you no less than my fatherland, I also permit you to erect in your neighborhood a bronze statue. Doesn't say of whom, whether Constantius or himself. But as you can see here, he is putting Alexandria on the same level as Constantinople. Alexandria, a city he's never visited and never will visit, yet a city that I think, as he says in his other letters to Alexandria, has a lot more cultural, pagan, Hellenic cachet and attachment to Alexander, of course, than this city here. Okay? So that's interesting. Finally, he gives some other reasons why it makes sense to bring the obelisk here. He says, also the report that there are certain people who worship and sleep around its capital has me totally convinced that it should be removed because of this superstitious practice. He's talking about the Christians. When people see folks sleeping there, while there's so much trash and trashy behavior happening all around it, they will disbelieve that the obelisk is a divine thing, and on account of the superstition of those hanging around it, have less faith in the gods, right? So he's making a religious argument, right? He is trying to say, we need to bring this here so that it can be given its proper reconsecration, okay? And so, of course, Julian, who is now reopening the temples, restoring investment in pagan worship, of course, is trying to do that in this city as in any other city, okay? And this is one way that will be symbolic of that. However, clearly, this didn't end up happening, probably because he died, and then finally Theodosius the First comes along after he takes power in 379 and eventually gets it here for us to see today. Okay. Let's talk about a few other of his possible projects. And the source for this is another fanboy of Julian who comes much later, named Zosimus. Now, Zosimus is from the late 5th, early 6th century. He's one of the last pagan literary sources we have in late antiquity. Okay, he's an historian. He really likes Julian, and he's willing to say a lot of things to make Julian look good, even if they are not necessarily true. So this is what Zosimus says about Julian's building program. He says, he let the city have a senate, a gerousia, just like Rome, and built for it a massive harbor to protect ships from the dangers of the south wind and a portico, C-shaped, that is lunate sigma, right, shaped instead of straight, leading down to that harbor. He also constructed a library in the imperial portico, where he stored all the books he had. Okay. By the way, this is not the harbor of Julian. This is further west, as you know. This is I walked along and found that bit of the sea walls on the Sea of Marmara the other day and took a nice stroll. But I thought this would be a nice pairing for a picture here. Okay. All right. So Zosimus makes a ton of errors in his history of Julian that people like Matthews have pointed out. And it's quite likely that Zosimus here is attributing to Julian things that are much more likely to have happened under Constantius, who visited the city multiple times during his multiple-decade reign, and that we also have evidence from other sources that he completed. So what may be going on here is that Zosimus is seeing projects that Julian perhaps completed that Constantius had begun, okay, rather than things that he took up of his own initiative, much like the obelisk, right? Okay. So let's see here. First off, the Senate. Okay, it is definitely Constantius who elevated the city council of Constantinople to the level of a Roman Senate equal to that of the Senate of Rome. Okay. People like Sarah Bassett think that perhaps Zosimus is not referring to the actual body of the Senate, but to the Senate House, but is likely that there is no evidence that Julian had any hand in any of the Senate houses, such as the Augustaion here. Okay. No evidence for a portico, and so let's go on to the harbor. Okay. So the harbor of Julian is called the Harbor of Julian for a reason. And so this is probably the only major building project that Julian probably had the most of a hand in and took credit for. Okay? Some of the sources, such as Procopius and the Chronicon Pascale, mention that the Harbor of Julian, which was here, okay, even had a pillar with Julian's statue on top of it, okay, to make it its namesake. Okay, so later it is renamed the Harbor of Sophia, who is the empress married to the Emperor Justin II, and later it becomes associated with the Caudoscalion. Okay, so right here, as opposed to the Harbor of Theodosius here. Okay, so I'm willing to, so it seems that Julian was willing to have a major building project here to put his name on the map of the city. Okay, but that is the only one that we really have any convincing evidence of. Okay, fine. However, there's still some evidence from both the orators Themistius and Hymerius that some of these harbor works were not entirely of Julian's initiative. Okay, so Hymerius, in a speech delivered in Constantinople several years before Julian arrives, okay, he says, "You, Constantinople, even surpassed Romulus' city in wonder, and combined such great beauty with such great size that the city's inhabitants would have nothing of beauty to compare to yours. Freighters sail to you from all over and from every harbor, with no need of a Tiber to reach your circuit walls. No, they put in right from the sea and tie their lines to your fortifications." So people like Muriel Moser would say that this is referring specifically to this side of the city if they're coming directly from the sea rather than into the Golden Horn where some of the earlier harbors were. Okay, and then there's some evidence from Themistius as well, who is another orator who is orating under Constantius. Okay, all right, now let's talk about the library, where I was working earlier today to finish this presentation. Not this library. He didn't build the Onomed library, or Constantius didn't either. But here's what Themistius, who was a big fan of Constantius, wrote in an oration delivered to Constantius shortly before Julian's reign. He says, he's referring to the library, "The tombs of these souls," okay, of the pagan classics, "are their books and their writings, in which are stored their relics as though in mausolea. Constantius is ordering them restored, and is appointing supervisors for the work, and is supplying their team with what's needed. In a short time later on will be revived for you at public expense the all-wise Plato. Revived will be Aristotle, the orator of Paeania," which is Demosthenes, and the sons of Theodorus and Olorus. Okay, and that is referring to Lysias and to Thucydides. Okay. So as you see here, Themistius clearly sees that there's a library, scriptoria, and various other sorts of educational investments made by Constantius. Okay, and this is again stuff that Muriel Moser talks about in her book, that better place the actual, at least physical library and scriptoria under Constantius. And perhaps Julian did deposit some of his personal library here, okay, but that's simply adding books to an existing library, an existing project, right? He did not build a whole library, okay? Okay, a few more things about Julian and Constantinople, namely his relationship with the Senate of Constantinople, which was comprised of various Eastern elites that Constantius had elevated to the level of senator and was then appointing to various provincial posts as governors, proconsuls, etc. Okay. One of the first things Julian did when he came here and took power was he had several of Constantius's corrupt officials court-martialed. And it's interesting that he had this take place not here, but across the Bosporus in Kadikoi. Okay? And it was a military tribunal that was staffed by generals from his own western armies, as well as Constantius's former eastern armies, as well as a couple of civilians, namely Claudius Mamertinus, okay, and Salutius, who both came from the west with him. So there was no involvement of any Eastern senators or Eastern civilians in these trials, and they were conducted far away from here, or at least across the Bosporus. Okay, so that's something to take into account. Next, during Julian's reign, especially early on, he is making appointments to posts such as the governor of Greece, okay, the Count of the East, proconsul of Asia. And it's interesting that Julian is putting Western senators in a lot of these posts. The trend under Constantius, as recognized by Matthews and by Muriel Moser and others, they see Constantius trying to create an separate Eastern hierarchy of power and senatorial aristocracy by continually appointing Eastern senators or senators of Eastern extraction to Eastern governorships. Julian is now putting Westerners back in here. Okay, so that's interesting. Next, people like Johannes Weinand have looked at the numismatic record. And it's interesting that when Julian gets here and throughout his entire 5 or 6 months here, the imperial mint of Constantinople does not produce any coins. And this corresponds to the lack of evidence that he gave any sort of gifts to members of the Eastern aristocracy, okay, who are based in this city. The only people he gave donatives and largesse to were the Eastern armies, for very good practical reasons of getting the armies on his side, because when you're a Roman emperor, that's the most important stakeholders, right, to make happy, right? So give them lots of money, especially at the start of your reign, so that they don't try to assassinate you before you've even started, okay? Also on the topic of coins, and this is something that Noah Lenski and Ramsgold talk about. Under Julian's Constantian predecessors, there was a popular reverse coin type in which the personifications of Rome and of Constantinople are enthroned side by side in a symbolizing equality between the two cities, between Old Rome and New Rome, as it were. Julian discontinues this series of coins of reverse types. Okay? And that is resumed under Julian's successors, such as Jovian. Okay, so Julian clearly does not want Constantinople to be seen on a level of equality with Rome, okay, as Constantius did and his successors did. Next, more snubbing of Constantinople in many respects. When Julian was on his path to civil war in 361, he based himself in the city of Naissus, of Niš in modern-day Serbia, which happened to be Constantine's birthplace. Interesting symbolism there. And from that base of operations, he issued a few formal manifestos justifying why he's going to war with Constantius, why he had no choice. He tried to use diplomacy. He is much more legitimate than Constantius anyway, so please accept me as a legitimate emperor despite my usurpation. Okay? He addresses these letters formally by name to 4 places. Rome, the Senate of Rome, and the city councils of Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. Not Constantinople. You would think Constantinople would be included if he is issuing manifestos like this. And of course, these are manifestos that are not just going to these cities, but they are also being distributed elsewhere. However, they are formally addressed to these 4 cities, not Constantinople. Okay? And Zosimus, sorry, got cut off a little bit, is our source, as well as Ammianus, for the cities that he officially wrote to. Okay? So that's interesting, that he would rather write to these cities that, for the most part, would be considered political backwaters, rather than the centers of political power. But for him, these are centers of historical and intellectual and cultural capital that I believe he is trying to re-emphasize in his re-paganization and re-Hellenization of the empire as he sees it. Okay? Though for what it's worth, Corinth is the functional capital of the province of Achaia. But Sparta, okay, Sparta hasn't really been relevant for several centuries at this point. Of course, Athens has a little more importance, but you can see, again, what he's doing. Okay. I'm coming toward the end here. There's a lot more that I can say, but this is what I got for you today. Now, what else does Julian say about Constantinople? Now, there are some of his panegyrics to Constantius where he clearly is emphasizing Rome over Constantinople, but that's partly because he has a largely Western audience celebrating the victory of Constantius over the usurper Magnentius in 357. So I won't pay too much attention to that. I can talk about that in Q&A. But there's an interesting, very tantalizing bit of one of the last things that Julian wrote. This was during the Saturnalia of December of 362 while he was in Antioch. And this is one of my favorite works of his called The Caesars. Okay? The entire 4th chapter of my book is devoted to a close reading of this work. And it's a satire / Platonic dialogue in which several Roman emperors, including Constantine, have a contest over who is the best emperor before a banquet of the gods, okay, up in the heavens. And after each emperor gives a speech, there is a question and answer round. There's an interrogation, kind of a Socratic elenchus, conducted by Hermes as well as the satyr Silenus, who is a bit of the comic relief of this satire. And after Constantine sort of gives his speech about all of his accomplishments, you know, I defeated barbarians, right? I saved the empire, et cetera. Silenus said, quote, "But Constantine, aren't you just passing off to us as your accomplishments mere gardens of Adonis?" And then Constantine, who clearly is not educated enough to know what this is referring to, says, "What do you mean by gardens of Adonis?" And Silenus explains, "The ones that women plant for Aphrodite's boyfriend. They scoop up a bit of soil into potsherds, but not long after they're planted, they immediately start withering away." Now, these are gardens of Adonis, right? You take some broken pottery, you scoop up some soil, you plant something in it, and as you could expect, these are not going to last that long. And the Spanish scholar Maria Pilar Garcia Ruiz thinks that this is a possible allusion to the idea that Anthusa, flowering Constantinople, okay, is being put in equality with Flora or Florentissima Roma. Okay, these are kind of floral terms that are being applied to both cities in their respective ideologies at the time. So that's a possible allusion, and the implication here is that Julian thinks that Constantine's accomplishments symbolized by this city is not going to last that long, and eventually are just going to wither away and die. The irony, of course, being that it's actually Julian who's not going to last much longer, and this city is going to last for another 1,100 years. Okay, as a Roman city, that is. Okay, and of course last up until today as a very flourishing city, as I discovered this past week. Okay, so oh well. So Julian eventually dies, and I think it's interesting to talk about what his contemporaries say about what Julian would have wanted for his place of burial. Now, again, I said that he eventually ends up here, but it's like that Julian didn't want that. Okay, he was buried in Tarsus, eventually exhumed, brought here to the Church of the Holy Apostles. However, two of his fanboys, contemporary with him, have some different ideas. Libanius, okay, one of his greatest exponents, says, the town of Tarsus in Cilicia received his remains, but more rightly with that of the Academy of Athens, next to Plato, so that students and teachers might forever perform the rites for him that they do for Plato as well. So Libanius is much more interested in Julian as an intellectual, as a philosopher, as an orator, okay, and it's corresponds to the fact that Julian has a lot of affection for Athens. We saw that Athens was one of the recipients of his manifestos, okay, and not Constantinople. Okay, so there's your eastern city that he should have been buried in, according to Libanius. And then comes the Latin historian Ammianus Marcellinus, and he says this: if anyone at the time were in their right mind, okay, or recte consuleret, it shouldn't have been the Cydnus in Tarsus, the river, that was in sight of his remains and ashes, but so that the glory of his good deeds may live on forever, the Tiber ought to be flowing by them, as it bisects the eternal city of Rome and runs past the memorials of the deified emperors of old. So Ammianus believes that the tomb of Julian should be like that of Augustus, like of Hadrian and other emperors buried along the Tiber in the Campus Martius or on the other side of it, as a proper Roman hero. So these are the two cities that I believe Julian most favors in his ideology. And it's interesting that Libanius and Ammianus kind of in complementary fashion seem to allude to that. Okay? But it's not here, despite what we can see today. Çok teşekkürler. And here's a selected bibliography for some of the good folks that I talked about. Some of them might be friends of yours, for all I know. Okay,
so maybe we can have some questions if you have. If not, maybe I can start.
Okay.
So it appears to me that there is a dichotomy of messages, public messages here. So there's on one side Julian, he cares about Constantinople and feeds it, but on the other hand, there are more important cities for him. Mm-hmm. So can we? Does that point to an audience difference of these sources, or what can you more tell about this dichotomy? Why it is happening, and to who the message is for?
Right. That's a great question. So part of what I do is I try to separate what Julian himself says in his writings and what his contemporaries say about him. And it is clear that his contemporaries interpret Julian differently than Julian presents himself, according to their own agendas. Okay, so people like Hymerius, who I didn't talk about much in this talk, okay, really try to associate Julian with Constantinople, because Hymerius wants there to be more focus on the Eastern Empire because he is an elite from Athens. Okay, and as we saw in that quotation by Hymerius, okay, he clearly sees elevating Constantinople as at the expense of Rome. Okay, Ammianus, on the other hand, okay, his audience is Romans in Rome, and he wants to present Julian as a proper Roman emperor who had this reputation of being too Greek. Okay, so he's sort of rehabilitating him. Okay, Julian's audience, okay, is people throughout the empire, largely educated people, who have familiarity with paideia. Okay, they know things about Greek literature, philosophy, right? And so, on his terms, he wants to have as wide a message among elites as possible, people who are who have social, cultural, political power. Okay, whereas other people, their tying of Julian to Constantinople, I think, is in a way that benefits them, such as Hymerius, and then of course Zosimus, right, who is in Constantinople, is also trying to claim that, hey, everybody here is Christian except me, basically, but look at all these great things Julian did for this city, and he was pagan, right? And this is something I forgot to mention with Zosimus, is you would think Zosimus would have said that Julian wrote also a manifesto to Constantinople if Zosimus wanted to elevate the status of Constantinople in Julian's eyes, but he doesn't. Okay, so that should be something to take into account. Right.
Thank you.
Yep. David.
So thank you very much. This is very nice. I'm looking forward to reading it in the future.
Thank you.
I have a question about actually Julian's time. How much time, or did he actually go to Rome at all? And so what's his idea of Rome?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so we know that, for example, both Constantine and Theodosius were in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the works that they did here definitely are referencing specific buildings and things like that. And if he didn't spend that much time in Rome, how much time would he have spent with Roman senators or other Roman elites who happened to be wherever he happened to be over the course of his life as Caesar and etc. So
Right.
and later on here.
Yep. Thank you, David. Excellent question, and an important question to also address next to everything I talked about. But of course, I would need twice as much time. And again, this is all things I talk about in my book. Julian never visited Rome. And the reason for that is not because he didn't want to, as a lot of people assume. He never had the opportunity. Okay? Up until he became emperor himself, his life was entirely controlled by his cousin Constantius II, who was trying to keep him away from Constantinople as much as possible. Well, of course, he's going to try to keep him away from Rome as much as possible, which is another center of power where he can network with the senatorial aristocracy there as well. Okay? And so when Julian does become sole emperor, right? He's already here, and then his agenda is his trajectory is eastward, okay, to pursue the Persian War, score a great victory to legitimize himself, and then possibly return to Rome and hold a triumph, I think, because in 357 Constantius II comes to Rome in a triumphal entry, despite the fact that his victory was in a civil war. So, but now Julian said, I think Julian would have wanted to have an actual legitimate victory in a foreign war and then have that triumphal entry into Rome. That is a bit of speculation, but I think it makes perfect sense. Now, if you look at Julian's writings, he says a lot of great things about Rome. He's very interested in the city of Rome. He talks about its religious topography, okay, its various temples, and he interprets the various cult practices of Rome, the city itself, through his own kind of philosophical lenses. He is very interested in the figures of the founders of Romulus, as well as Numa Pompilius, the founder of Roman religion and law. So he talks about Rome at much greater length than about Constantinople, as we saw here. Okay. In terms of his interaction with Roman elites, certainly he is inviting many to Constantinople. Many of them are traveling there anyway in order to ingratiate themselves with him because he's the new emperor, and of course, paying him a visit is going to be a good way to get on his good side, and of course he is then appointing them to these various posts, not just in the West, as is tradition, but also some of the Eastern posts, which was not a customary thing by then. So definitely his preference for Rome over Constantinople is immediately evident in his writings and in his policies.
It's interesting also, his wife is buried in Rome.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I do mention that in my book as well, right? So when his cousin wife Helena, right, passes away of illness in 361, shortly after his usurpation, he does bury her in the mausoleum that is now the Church of Santa Costanza. And there's actually some scholarship that argues that Julian may have actually built that mausoleum himself, rather than Constantius or Constantia, okay, the sister of Constantius. But I'm not an archaeologist to be able to have my own independent opinion on that. Thanks for bringing that up. She was also buried in a sarcophagus that had no Christian imagery. Interestingly, that's one of their arguments.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a fragment almost identical out here.
Mm.
So, the sarcophagus and then the fragment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, Kareem?
I think that piece, fragment of sarcophagus here in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum belongs to Constantius II.
Yep.
It's probably almost, as David mentioned,
Yep.
identical with the sarcophagus of Helena.
Mm-hmm.
Every details.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If there is no more questions, please join me thanking Jeremy, and thank you, Jeremy, for being here tonight.
Yes. And thanks again to you folks who attended. I know that with everything, all the programming last week, it was hard to fit me in then, and it was unfortunate that this had to happen when a lot of the fellows had to leave. But you did the best you could with that. And thanks again, Amir, for arranging this, and everyone for coming. So I look forward to coming back sometime.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So.